Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Last night, at least 22 innocent people were murdered by a suicide bomber in Manchester, England. Today, President Trump commented on the attack during a joint press conference with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
So many young, beautiful, innocent people living and enjoying their lives murdered by evil losers in life. I will call them from now on losers, because that's what they are. They're losers.
Well, you've seen this before, and you know what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, our leaders are going to tell us that acts of terror are just something that happens, like the weather. Just accept it and move on. There is nothing you can do, or better yet, just pretend it's not happening all around you. As Katie Kay, the BBC, put it this morning, Europe is, quote, getting used to attacks like this because they have to, because they're never going to be able to totally wipe this out. You hear that a lot, but consider it for a minute. Why is violent terrorism an inevitability in Europe now? Unless you grew up in Northern Ireland or Italy or the Basque Country, terrorism was not a significant hazard a generation or two ago. Ask someone who was alive then. This is new. Something has changed. What is it? Well, the answer, as most people understand, but relatively few admit, is that demographics change. There are a lot of Muslims living in Europe now. Most of them are indeed decent people, as we're often assured, but a surprisingly large number of them aren't. Check the numbers. In 2006, after just a year after terrorists murdered more than 50 people in London on the subway bombings, a full 20% of British Muslims said they sympathized with the motives of the bombers. Younger Muslims were even more enthusiastic about what had happened, about the killings. In 2007, Pew found that at least 20% of young Muslims here in America, in France, Germany, and Britain and Spain, believe that suicide bombings could be justified. In France, that number was above 40%. Last year, 29% of French Muslims said they viewed Sharia as a higher law than the civil laws of France. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised that radical views are common among Western Muslims because they're even more common in their home nations. In 2014, 47% of Bangladeshi Muslims said suicide bombings to defend Islam were acceptable, almost half. A quarter of Egyptians said the same thing. A fifth of Turks and Malaysians agreed. In 2009, 78% of Pakistani Muslims told Pew that people who leave Islam should be killed, murder for apostasy. In Egypt, support for that was 86%, Afghanistan 79%, Bangladesh 44%, Iraq 42%. Well, these are not little places, obscure theocracies in remote regions. They're some of the biggest countries in the Muslim world, and more to the point, they've sent millions of immigrants to the West. We could go on like this for the whole show. There's an awful lot of research on the subject, and all the numbers tell the same story. Why are they being ignored? Now, our leaders like to boast they believe in science, that they let data and hard evidence drive their policies. They are lying, and never more obviously than in this case. They don't want to see the numbers. They actively suppress them. If you really cared about America, you wouldn't want it to become Europe, dangerous, divided, unstable. You wouldn't import a massive Muslim minority into your country simply because it made you feel open-minded and virtuous, and then hope for the best. That's a faith-based approach, and it's nuts. We know exactly what will happen if we do that because we're watching it live on television from Manchester right now. If you really cared about the country you led, you'd figure out how to make sure that every person you imported of any religion enthusiastically shared your most cherished values: tolerance, pluralism, free speech, equality under the law, just for starters. You tell them not to litter, by the way, when they're here, too. We do the opposite. Our leaders worship multiculturalism, so we encourage immigrants to reject our culture in favor of their own because all cultures are equal, except that they're not all equal, as we were reminded last night with the murder of children in an arena in Manchester. Defend what you believe or you will lose it. That's the message of Manchester, just as it is also the basic lesson of all of history. But what if you don't believe in anything at all? Our leaders don't. Maybe that's why they can't defend us. Majid Nawaz is a former Islamic extremist. He's thought a lot about this. He's co-founder of the anti-Islamist group Quilliam, and he joins us tonight. Nawaz, thanks a lot for coming on. So,
Pleasure.
What's the response from the West that wants to remain pluralist, certainly doesn't want to ban people based on their religion or their country? Most people don't want to do that, but they also don't want to have unstable, chaotic societies. What do they do?
Well, currently, and you're correct, there's this meme going around that this is the new normal, that we must just come to terms with this and that we must carry on as normal, act calm, behave calm, and stand united. And that's all well and good. Of course, there is a role for solidarity. It's absolutely essential we show solidarity to the victims and the families of this horrific attack. But, you know, what kind of world is it in which I have to accept that the slaughter of my children, of youth in a concert is normal, and that's just nothing I can do about it? What kind of world do we want to live in, where we just accept that as a status quo? In any other world, that would be called apathy and appeasement. In fact, we should never accept that as a normal. And that leads to another meme that's going around, that these are somehow lone wolves, which again speaks to your introduction. These aren't lone wolves. In fact, this is a myth, this idea of lone wolves. Research, back to facts and study, research found that up to 80% of jihadist attacks and the attackers are connected to networks, ideologies, groups, and others who knew of their radicalization. They are almost never alone. But this myth of the fact that they are lone actors serves three purposes mainly. One is it allows security services, when they commit mistakes and oversights, to say there was nothing we could do about it anyway because they were lone actors. We couldn't have stopped them nor predicted them. It allows politicians, number two, to say there's nothing we can do about it and thereby retreat to a politically correct standard. And third, it allows, most importantly, our communities to shirk responsibility, because, of course, the truth is we're in the midst in Europe of a jihadist insurgency where people who are like me and others and live among us have become radicalized, and it wasn't ISIS that radicalized them. Right. ISIS plucked the low-hanging fruit. They've been radicalized for decades because of this ideology that's been spreading in our communities.
So what do we do about it? What do authorities do about it? I mean, again, how do you maintain a liberal, in the best sense, free society when you're actually living among people who want to kill you? I mean, how do you stop that?
So if we understand it in this way, that there is an ideology that's been recruiting for decades, I say decades, and ISIS simply plucked the low-hanging fruit, then the first thing we need to do is, look, if I was living during the US civil rights crisis, back in the days when segregation was still rife, you would call me an apologist if I didn't get involved to fight segregation, racial segregation. You don't have to be Muslim to challenge this extremism. Muslims and non-Muslims all have to stand together to challenge Islamist theocratic extremism, just as we're responsible to challenge racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and other ills in society. So this is a full-on civil society campaign to reassert and protect our liberal values against these theocratic values, and that genuinely requires action from government, but more importantly from communities.
People have to stop being embarrassed and stand up for the Enlightenment values that our society is based on. It doesn't seem hard, but it is hard, and you are leading the fight for that, and I appreciate your coming on tonight to talk to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, British police are aggressively investigating the attack that occurred last night in Manchester, but it's not their only priority tonight. They're also keeping an eye out for crime-think on the internet. Those are unapproved thoughts that people might express, including those from DailyMail.com columnist Katie Hopkins. She tweeted after the attacks this: Western men, these are your wives, your daughters, your sons. Stand up, rise up, demand action. Do not carry on as normal, cowed. Well, for that, another Twitter user reported her to the police in Great Britain, and the police confirmed they were investigating. She was also reported for a since-deleted tweet, which she said she miswrote, saying that Britain needed a final solution to terrorism. She reworded that later. Katie Hopkins joins us tonight. So terrorists attack an arena in Manchester and kill children, and you're under investigation. How does that work exactly, Katie?
I really don't know anymore here in the UK. What I can say is there's certain thoughts you're just simply not allowed to have. So for me to say that this is no good anymore, it's not good enough even to say that we can't carry on as normal. I demand action. I want people to use their anger to say, we need to do something to stop this. We need to be deporting these people, deport the people that are hiding them, and get amongst this, because this is our little girl, our 8-year-old little Safi that died, slaughtered. We need to be able to talk like that We're not allowed to talk like that. Now, clearly, certain things I tweet, you know, I absolutely accept words matter. I use the word final solution in a tweet, and I would not in any way want to use that term and the inference other people lay on that. What I meant was we need a lasting solution, a resolution to this.
You got to figure out how to
my
fix
deep
it.
upset.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, it's that, but, you know, it's 24 hours now since I woke up to the news of what had gone on, and I just feel what we're missing is that real feeling of emotion connecting with the fact that this is our little girls. These are our children. This could be our children next. You know, we've just had the threat level raised to critical, which is the maximum level. Military are coming into our streets, which, of course, is a great thing. But what I always wonder, Tucker, is how did we go from saying we are strong, we stand united, we are not cowed, to tanks arriving on our street? We do have a problem. We did have a problem. And now our little girls have been slaughtered in the worst possible way with nails and nuts and bolts in a homemade bomb. My children at breakfast this morning said, you know what, I'd much rather be shot than caught in a bomb that's made of ball bearings. And I just wonder, you know, what conversation are we having here in 21st century Britain when that's what children are growing up with? Children are growing up with terror being normal and a man planting a bomb filled with nuts in bolts when they're out having fun. That's normal in Britain. And we brought that war into our country. We brought that war onto our pavements, onto our streets. And I don't hear anybody still, no politician standing up and saying, I am sorry, we were wrong, we are going to change what we have done.
Of course not.
Islamic extremism cannot go on.
They're investigating you for your tweets in the country that gave the rest of us freedom of speech. I mean, this is very quickly kind of a philosophical question, but is a government that is demonstrably unwilling to defend its own children, and they are, despite the slogans and the tanks, this is going on a long time, is that a legitimate government? I mean, what's the point of having a government if they won't protect your children? Seriously.
Absolutely. It seems to me that the establishment are now on the side of anything that represents diversity or indeed Muslims supporting Islam. We immediately have to say the Greater Manchester head of police came out this evening and said, you know, we will not tolerate hate against the Muslim community. And for so many of us, we're kind of saying, well, it's OK, then we will tolerate our little girl, 8-year-old girls being slaughtered as they leave a concert, but we won't tolerate hate speech. That seems to be where we're at in the UK tonight.
Well, this is, and around the world, and this is exactly why there are political revolutions, very uncomfortable, messy ones taking place throughout the West, exactly because of this reason. Katie, thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
The media love covering Russia and hate covering Manchester and events like it. Up next, we'll explain why those are related phenomena and how the West may have something to gain from cooperating with, hold your breath now, Russia against Islamic extremism. Plus, Joe Concha will be here to talk about the press and its botched coverage last night that really defied parody. We've got examples. Stay tuned. If you were watching other news networks last night, you may have noticed that it took them a while to start covering the terror attack in the UK once it happened. Instead, they spent almost an hour continuing to chase after claims of collusion, you may have heard this before, stop me if you have, between Russia and President Trump. And if you watch those networks over the past couple of weeks, we not recommend that, of course, but if you have, you've seen a never-ending parade of lawmakers, people who've been elected, claiming Russia has seized control of the White House somehow.
There is reason to believe that the president's pandering to Russia is endangering our national security, our economy, and our democracy.
The cost of the president's ties to Russia cannot be our national security. And if this story is true, I'm afraid that's a price we may pay.
I really do believe that much of what you saw coming out of Trump's mouth was a play from Putin's playbook.
Now, what do these two topics have in common? They may appear wholly unrelated. Manchester attacks last night and Russia, but they are actually connected. The press's fear-mongering about Russia, its distaste for honestly covering Islamic terror, are related to one another. Because if you thought about it for even a second, and apparently a lot of people here haven't, you'd realize the U.S. may have something to gain by cooperating with Russia in checking radical Islam. Now, to note the obvious, the Russians are not likely to become trusted allies, ever. Russia, like pretty much every other country except for, well, ours, looks out for its own interests first. And sometimes those interests are directly opposed to our interests. That will never change. But on this one matter, radical Islam, Russia has both a shared interest and ample expertise on the subject. They've got a huge Muslim minority amounting to about 10% of the population. That's higher than any Western European nation. They've had to deal with an Islamist insurgency in Chechnya, as well as multiple terror attacks that have killed hundreds. And of course, they've intervened in Syria. Now, not just to protect President Assad and secure a warm water port, those are probably goals too, but also to fight Islamists, which they're actively doing, like the Russians or not, they are doing that. In other words, on this one vital question, Russia is aligned with us. Now, you'd think that would be obvious, just as it was obvious to Franklin Roosevelt 80 years ago to make common cause with Joseph Stalin in the fight against the Nazis, and it worked. But no, it's 1953 all over again with the Democratic Party in the McCarthy seat impugning the character of anyone who dares to note the obvious. I know because it's happened to me, agent of Russia that I am. Everyone enjoys a good witch hunt from time to time, but this one appears to be hurting our national security. David Teferi is a former Obama campaign foreign policy advisor. He once worked at the State Department, and I know that he's going to agree with me on this. Let me start with the obvious question. Which is a bigger threat to the U.S., ISIS or Russia?
Both are a huge threat.
Which is bigger?
Well, I think ISIS is a more immediate threat, absolutely. But Russia has a much stronger military. Russia can hurt us and hurt U.S. interests all over the world. So we have to worry about both.
So let me just, we don't have the graphic because I'm just kind of going here with the facts as they are. We have on the one side ISIS, Islamic Terror, Al-Qaeda. Over the past 15 years, thousands of Americans have lost their lives, many thousands, to those forces. Russia has killed, let me just see, 0 Americans. So it's really not even in the same universe, actually, the threat we face from Islamic terror and the threat we face from Russia. One is theoretical, the other is real and present. So why are we not seeing that?
Well, first of all, Tucker, you can't evaluate the threat just based on how many American lives have been lost. Russia is a threat to democracy. It's a threat to our way of life. Look at what Russia has done in Ukraine. It annexed Crimea. It is in eastern Ukraine. It's killed a lot of people in Ukraine. Ukraine wanted to be part of the West. It wanted to be a democracy. It wanted to join Europe. It wanted to be our ally. Russia has been threatening democracy for a long time. Okay. Look at the Cold War.
Wait, hold on. But before we jump back 26 years, let me just get to the discrete examples that you just listed. You say they're a threat to our way of life, to our democracy. I feel for the Ukrainians. I feel for the Crimeans. I feel for anybody whose nationalist hopes are thwarted. How is the annexation of Crimea or the conflict with Ukraine a direct threat to national security?
Because if Russia is allowed to annex Ukraine, it will annex another country next. It will annex one of the Baltic states.
Idaho?
It'll annex 2 of the Baltic
California?
states.
I mean, how will that affect American national security?
Do you not believe that there are countries like Russia who have who desire to undermine democracy all over the world,
lots of them,
particularly in Europe, and part of their strategy,
I think they're members of Congress
for doing that is undermining democratic efforts in countries like Ukraine, in the Baltic states.
I'm asking you simple questions. Just give me simple answers, if you would. How is Russia's expansionist tendencies, which are shared by a lot of countries around the world, lots of countries want to be bigger. This is the story of the world, of history. How does Russia's behavior in Eastern and Central Europe threaten America's critical national security interests or America's democracy?
Because one of the things that America has always stood for is freedom and spreading democracy around the world. And the biggest foe of freedom and the spread of democracy is Russia. And we see that now in lots of different places where Russia is an actor, particularly in Eastern Europe, where it has designs on recreating a Russian empire, on recreating colony-type states that it had when it was the USSR.
Just for the hell of it, I'm going to ask the question one more time, because you didn't answer the question I asked. You basically said Russia's behavior offends our values as Americans, and I would agree with that completely. But that's not the criterion upon which we make war decisions. We go to war, we are enemies with someone when their behavior threatens our national security, something you said Russia did. So I'm going to ask you one final time. How does their behavior threaten our national security or our democracy itself, as is often the claim? I don't understand that.
Okay, let's take Syria, for instance. Russia
given up on Crimea.
Well, we talked about that a lot.
Okay.
I could talk about it all hour if you want. But take Syria. Russia intervened in Syria in September 2015. After the Obama administration failed to act and failed to punish Syria for crossing the red line. And that was a mistake. But when Russia intervened in September, it said it was intervening to fight ISIS. 1 week after its military and airstrikes, State Department said more than 90% of those airstrikes were against U.S.-backed forces in Syria, not against ISIS.
Okay,
That's how.
So because we back a series of Islamist rebel groups, some with ties to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which we currently do, which, by the way, is insane, and because Russian bombing may have hurt some of those Islamists, that's a threat to our national security? If you could just, I know we don't have a ton of time left, but just connect the dots there for me if you would.
Sure, let me connect the dots for you. We are trying to stabilize Syria. We need to stabilize Syria. More than 400,000 people have been killed in Syria. Russia is not trying to stabilize Syria. Russia is propping up the Assad regime, which is fueling ISIS. ISIS was born out of the crisis in Syria, the fact that no one was supporting the moderates who were opposing Assad, and the Sunni population turned to ISIS. That's what created ISIS.
Boy.
ISIS is a convenient foe for Russia because ISIS is helping fight the battles that Russia once fought. Do you think Russia cares that there was an ISIS-sponsored attack in Manchester?
Probably not.
Russia.
Probably not. But
exactly.
I guess I kind of remember Syria when it was stable. And guess who ran it? Oh, the Assad family ran it.
That's correct.
So it's hard to look me in the face and say supporting a bunch of people, some of whom may be good-hearted, some may be lunatics, is making a country more stable than what it was 8 years ago when it was run by a dictator who hated America and Israeli. Bad guy, but it was stable, and now it's not. But so, like, call me stupid, but that seems like the fact.
So then you agree with President Obama that we should have not done anything in Syria? Because remember, the revolution that started in Syria, the U.S. didn't start that revolution. Okay. That was a revolution that started on its own, and it happened. And there were forces that went against Assad, and then eventually, when we didn't do anything, Russia went in. Now we have a destabilized country that helped create ISIS. We have a humanitarian disaster that's causing refugees to flee to Europe and to the U.S. And we have more than 400,000 people killed.
I've lost any confidence.
Especially U.S.
Any confidence I ever had in the ability of intellectuals in Washington to make the world stable. They've made it less stable, and now I'm really worried about their judgment. That's my.
So now you want Russia to do it?
I'm not saying that at all. I don't take any of this at face value anymore. I used to. David, thank you. British Prime Minister Theresa May is warning that Manchester, the attacks last night, could be one of several attacks coming up soon. Is there anything we can learn from this, and how can the U.S. avoid becoming a victim of it? We'll talk to two terrorism experts next. Stay tuned.
It is now concluded, on the basis of today's investigations, that the threat level should be increased for the time being from severe to critical. This means that their assessment is not only that an attack remains highly likely, but that a further attack may be imminent.
That was British Prime Minister Theresa May warning that Manchester may just be the first of several attacks targeting the UK. Her warning shows that extremist ideology remains a depressingly constant threat, one that President Trump called on Islamic nations to take the lead in rooting out during his recent trip to the Saudi kingdom.
A better future is only possible if your nations drive out the terrorists and drive out the extremists. Drive them out. Drive them out of your places of worship. Drive them out of your communities. Drive them out of your holy land. And drive them out of this earth.
So how else can the U.S. hope to prevent future Manchesters? Were there any warning signs that the rest of us missed? R.P. Eddy is a former White House National Security Council director. Aaron Cohn is a former member of Israel's counterterrorism unit. They both join us tonight. R.P., to you first. You just wrote this book, which I read and really enjoyed, called Warnings, in which you say that for almost every disaster that faces our society, there were people who called it, from the financial collapse to the rise of ISIS, and the rest of us ignored them. Were there warnings that we missed for what's happening in Europe right now?
Well, yeah, as you said, just to start with every disaster I can think of in my lifetime, there was a person who said very clearly, hey, this is going to happen, pay attention to me.
Right.
There was a very clear person warning about the rise of ISIS. He happened to be the U.S. ambassador to Syria. He was saying there's a vacuum that's going to be filled by a Sunni fundamentalist group. He didn't know their name, he didn't know what they looked like, but lo and behold, here's ISIS. So you have little girls dying in London because of a problem we didn't get right 4 years ago. So sometimes we don't listen to that Cassandra, that warner, the person who's trying to tell you about something dramatic you need to understand. You pay a cost for a long, long time, and that's what we're seeing right now.
You certainly do. So, Aaron, what exactly are the steps that we take, the actual steps as Western nations, to prevent what looks like is going to happen, an endless cycle of this stuff? How do you stop it?
Well, my experience coming from Israel is that you have to not take a soft approach to protecting soft targets. Soft targets are non-government, heavily protected installations. This concert was a soft target. Got an American artist performing with one of our allies who's been at war with us, partnering against Al-Qaeda and ISIS for the last 15 years. So the layering needs to be there. And what I mean by that is multiple layers, meaning it would take a multi-failure event in order for the terrorist to reach its target. And that means that we deploy a three-part system in Israel, and it works, and this wasn't in place. And what I mean by that is the first one is deterrence, and that means having enough armed presence and enough checkpoints far enough away out from the venue. Two would be the detection phase, which is plainclothed officers and checking bags, scurrying under. Here's the thing, with terrorism, Tucker, it's all about the crowds. Their goal is to kill the most amount of people in the shortest period of time. So the triangle of success for counterterror or for counterterror for these operations is that detection is 2, and then 3 is the denial. And so it's almost like where was the security at this concert? This guy went in, he looked at it, all these people were congregating at the end of the show. That's when security lacks. That's when you have to dial it up. So you have to take a no BS look at exactly where these crowds are going to be in relation to this event at any given point. And if we don't do that here, just like the gentleman just said, that 4 years ago the warning signs were put out, like, we're going to see this here. So
of course
every one of these massive events needs to be taken seriously.
Well, and they are. It's just hard to believe someone would target little girls. It's so beyond the range of what you would even think of. So RP, I guess the obvious question is, are leaders in the West, both in Europe and here, aware of the current risks? You've seen massive demographic change in Europe in the past 2 years, massive. A lot of people coming in who, according to surveys, may be sympathetic to some of the attitudes that produced the Manchester terror bombing. Are the leaders in Western Europe aware of that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. We've seen a real debate inside the body politic about how we ought to deal with the rising immigrant numbers and the people who, in some instances, are the families of or the actual terrorists themselves. I'll leave that to the voters and the politicians. But one thing that's interesting here, we spend some time looking at ISIS, watching their propaganda, trying to learn about them. And what we've seen as they've begun to lose territory in Iraq and Syria is they've sent out more and more fervent messages to the people around the world who may be recruited by them, saying, please go off and take on terrorist attacks of your own. So ISIS doesn't just become a landlord who owns this fake caliphate in Iraq and Syria. They become what I call an idea of mass destruction, getting out there, radicalizing, and getting people to do their bidding. And that's very likely what we'll see here. And I think that's what we've seen in the Bastille Day attacks and a number of attacks across Europe and many attempted attacks in the United States.
So as they get weaker on the battlefield, they get crazier and more dangerous. I mean, that's like a basic principle of life. RP, Aaron, thanks a lot to both of you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
The American media embarrassed itself with its glacial response to the attack in Manchester last night, in case you didn't notice. Joe Conch will be here to explain why that happened and why some channels felt Russia mattered more than blood in the streets in the United Kingdom. Plus, bringing shocking news about MS-13 and how the Obama administration apparently spread the gang throughout American cities. It's not a claim we would make if we didn't have the documents to prove it, but we do. Well, the media hardly acquitted themselves well with their coverage of last night's bombing in Manchester. Okay, we're into understatement. It was awful. First of all, it took them a long time to shut up about Russia and actually cover it. Fox began covering the attack at 6:48 p.m. Eastern. The other two cable networks, not so much. At 7, we began covering Manchester exclusively. The other networks still leading with Russia. Chris Matthews even moved back to Russia where you could hear people screaming in the background. Surely after a half hour, things had changed. Wrong. At 7:30, you guessed it, still on Russia. At 7:36, they still weren't covering Manchester like it was a gruesome attack. We knew it was by then, but you wouldn't know it by watching those channels. When the other media did start covering it, things weren't necessarily better. Over at CNN, analyst Paul Cruikshank took time to speculate the suicide bombing could have been a false flag by right-wingers, of course, apparently so committed to making Islam look bad, they're willing to kill themselves to do it. That's commitment, but you know the right, they're committed. Over at ABC, Martha Raddatz commented that Manchester was a surprising target because, we're quoting now, Manchester did not vote in favor of Brexit, as if the attack would be more understandable if the city had voted for Brexit. Not impressive. Joe Concha writes about the media for The Hill, and he joins us tonight. Joe, did you watch it last night? What'd you think?
I have a fortress of solitude down in my basement, Tucker, that allows me to watch 4 TVs at once. It's on Twitter. You can see pictures of it. So I'm able to watch
you
CNN.
Poor man.
Yeah, it's more for fantasy football, but also for my job as well. And look, there are some numbers around this that are just stunning. 105 minutes during the 7 p.m. hour, this is according to an MRC study, was spent on Trump and Russia on CNN and MSNBC. Just 50 minutes on an attack, grotesque, as you said, in the city of a Western ally where women and children, young girls going to a concert are killed. Any community access producer or manager would know in that situation that once this story broke at 6:48, it is full stop. There is no other story to cover. But this just shows you that it's media malfeasance marinated in myopia. Alliteration aside, this is what happens now when you're so locked into one story that you miss a story like this where everything should have gone away and this should have been the only thing that was covered.
Look, I mean, you know exactly. I've been doing this a long time. You've been covering it a long time. You know exactly what happened. Their formula is working. Their viewers think that Donald Trump is a marionette controlled by Vladimir Putin. They think this because they're being told it by the anchors over there who's spinning these incredibly complex and insane conspiracy theories. And they're getting good numbers by doing that. And so they don't even a terror attack won't get them off it because they're completely addicted to the drug of ratings. I mean, that's what it is.
It's not only what journalism looks like in 2017, Tucker, it's what it sounds like, and more importantly, it's what it smells like, and it sticks to your boots. Look, I agree with you that it's good for business, but if you look at the numbers last night, at 9 o'clock, for instance, Fox, Shepard Smith nearly doubled Rachel Maddow in what's called the key demographic that advertisers covet most. So, look, people they want their news, and I remember CNN, when I was growing up, it was the only game in town. Fox and MSNBC didn't come around until 1996, and I forget who said it, but somebody compared it to a spare tire, that you could always count on it to be there when you needed it. And last night, I couldn't find my spare tire. I could not believe that I kept seeing Brady Bunch panels on Donald Trump and Russia when they should have been covering this story. And it just goes back to CNN, and recent studies lately, Tucker, just shows you just how locked in they are on this topic. May 12th, another MRC study, 96 guests on that day were anti-Trump, just 7 pro-Trump. That's a 13-to-1 ratio. I mean, that's incredible.
But by the way, there's other news that's not Trump-related. Like, if you're a news channel, you should be bringing the news. It's not all about Donald Trump and Michael Flynn. I was talking to a friend of mine today who's actually not particularly pro-Trump. I think he voted against Trump. But he's watching the coverage, and he's saying, you know, there's nothing you could say that they wouldn't believe about Trump. Do you think if you went on to another channel and said, you know what, I have evidence that Trump drinks human blood, just like a shot glass of it every morning when he wakes up, do you think anybody would say, no, I don't, you know, that's just, you know, show me the evidence? They'd all like sort of nod in bovine agreement, like, yeah, of course he does.
And the narrative gets fueled by anonymous sources being used in every story that we see from the New York Times and Washington Post. And look, the New York Times has something called a style guide. And in it, one rule, and it's supposed to be used, and now it's the last rule, unfortunately, that anonymity should be the last resort. But now it's become the first resort, and that's what's fueling all of these stories, because it's not a matter of being accurate, it's a matter of being first, and it's a matter of being more about quantity than quality, and that's what journalism is in 2017, unfortunately. It's good for business, but it's bad for integrity.
No, it's bad. I mean, I have a lot of friends over at all these places, you know, nice people. I'll never believe anything they say ever again, ever, about anything, because they're liars. And it's sad. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, the attack in Manchester raises a lot of big questions about terrorism and the press and what President Trump ought to do in response. How does it all tie together? Well, whenever we have that question, there's one man we call. He is, of course, Brit Hume, and he joins us in a minute with the big picture. We've approached last night's attack in Manchester from a lot of directions tonight. We've looked at what it says about the press, about Islam in the West, and about our relationship with Russia. But there is a big picture here, what's really happened in the past 24 hours, and what does it mean for the Trump administration? How have they handled it? Brit Hume is our senior political analyst here at Fox, and he joins us now with that. So the president's foreign trip punctuated by this terror attack. What does that mean?
Two things. One is that to some extent it eclipses the trip in terms of news coverage. And the president needed some sustained, reasonably favorable news coverage, which he was certainly getting. On the other hand, it kind of reinforces his message, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, he presides basically at this 50-nation summit of 50 Muslim nation, majority Muslim nation summit, and delivers a stern message about the need to join together to fight terror. And then we have this hideous attack. So, that kind of vindicates his emphasis on that subject, and to that extent, it helps him. Of course, we're only beginning. He made a couple of comments that he called them terrorist losers, and I think that's perfectly fine, but I don't think that really means very much. But I think going forward now, we will see from him how he turns this event into a way to further his agenda. And that remains obviously to be seen.
Boy, there's one thing that can unite the country, at least potentially. It's an external threat, and there's no external threat more horrible and more easy to explain than ISIS. Is this, do you think, going to be a theme of the next year?
Well, we've seen a succession of these attacks overseas.
Right.
And while they have impact, particularly, this one was particularly hideous because of the children. I mean, it just seems so utterly barbaric to mount this kind of attack. But they tend to blow over. In fact, in this news cycle in which we're living these days, nearly everything seems to blow over.
Yes, I've noticed.
Unless you have, a news media that is absolutely determined to keep it alive. I mean, I keep thinking that the lesson of recent days in the news coverage of the Trump administration and the whole Russia thing is that, that guy Mike Flynn, they better get him to resign. Oh, wait. So, except for that, the coverage of this event, it'll peter out over time. Trump can follow it up, and we'll see what he does.
The risk, obviously, is that the Trump administration will find itself embroiled in some kind of foreign conflict. He ran against that.
Right.
But presidents historically have had a lot of trouble avoiding that. Do you think that's a potential risk?
Well, we are involved in some foreign conflicts already.
Well, sure we are.
We're involved in a struggle to eradicate ISIS, to name one. There are other, terror operations around the world that we're involved in trying to shut down. I think, it tends to be relatively low-level warfare because it's not a conventional, it's an asymmetrical kind of a conflict between this giant superpower with all its munitions and all its men and women under arms and these bands of terrorists. So it's, it requires a different kind of fight, and it doesn't excite quite the passions that war in Iraq, for example, excited, or some kind of conflict with Russia would obviously excite. I think he did run against that. On the other hand, we had for so many years, Tucker, practice a brand of diplomacy, which was diplomacy not really backed up by the threat of force.
Right.
And it has been a hallmark of American foreign policy since World War II.
It was party boat diplomacy.
It was exactly right. And it was, by and large, effective.
Yeah.
And we have sort of the theoretical threat of force that had been on the table for some years now, but nobody really believed in it. And of course, we had that astonishing event when the President Obama drew the line in Syria and then turned the whole case over to Russia. And that's obviously those days are gone. I think the Trump administration would never do anything like that. So we'll see what comes of that. But they're very serious issues here. Can we really find a successful way to really eradicate this threat?
Yes.
And it's not clear that anybody knows quite how to do that. And of course, uniting the Muslim world would be very helpful. We also have this very severe threat from North Korea, which is growing, which was allowed to fester all these years to the point where President Obama, who said and did very little about it, turns it over to the incoming President Trump and says, oh, by the way, you got this real stinker I'm about to hand you, and it's the worst threat you're going to face. So he's got that to contend with as well. Whether all of this or any of this could be done without ultimate use of force remains to be seen.
You might want to stay abroad. Britt, thanks a lot for joining us.
You bet, Tucker.
Appreciate it. We'll be right back. A minor news story. Most people missed it because it was reported in just a handful of outlets. But it said that MS-13 graffiti had been found sprayed on bathroom walls at the Nogales Placement Center. That's a facility where the U.S. government has processed hundreds of illegal immigrant children arriving from Central America. Now, you'd think committing criminal behavior in support of a violent gang would certainly be the kind of thing that would ensure your speedy deportation. But if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Because according to documents released today by the House Homeland Security Committee, personnel at the center quickly identified at least 18 juveniles as likely members of MS-13 and other criminal gangs. Many of them openly admitted it. One document we've obtained describes an arrival from El Salvador who, quote, self-admitting to being a gang member. He stated he was involved in multiple robberies, assaults, and drug dealing. The boy stated, quote, he sold both crack cocaine and marijuana, admitting attacking people with knives, said he planned to continue his gang affiliation as soon as he reached his family already here in the U.S. Pretty straightforward, right? He was turned right around and sent back to El Salvador. Surely, no, he wasn't. The Border Patrol placed him in a holding cell while trying to find a home for him here in the United States. That's what they did for all the suspected gang members. Another document provided to this show lists where most of them went. 8 suspected gang members from El Salvador were transferred to the Children's Village. It's a private reform school in New York City, a city that incidentally has struggled with the rise of MS-13. Maybe those are connected. 3 other suspected gang members were sent to Oklahoma, 2 were sent to Virginia, 2 to Washington State, 1 to Texas. Did these people ever get deported? Did they go free and simply join the general population of the country and then go on to prey on innocent people? We're still trying to find that out because the previous administration didn't track it. We'll tell you as soon as we do. In case this isn't obvious, this was the policy of the Obama administration, to import young men into our cities who we knew were likely dangerous criminals. No vote was held on this. The public was never alerted to it. You may have noticed your country is changing fast and probably not for the better. There are a lot of reasons for that, but this is definitely one of them. And we're going to continue to follow this story as we get more details. That's it for us tonight. We'll be back here at 8 tomorrow night for the show that's the sworn enemy of lying, pomposity, smugness, and groupthink. The 5 is next. We'll see you tomorrow.